Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We're starting a new book today, Ecclesiastes, and this is a very interesting book because it's from Solomon, but instead of the Proverbs, it's different from this book than the Proverbs. Is that this is more of a teacher. Um, if you were sitting under a teacher. Might even say a philosophy teacher in some respects. I wouldn't necessarily put that title on it, but the idea is that he's going to give some insights into very specific kind of key issues of life. Basically, you could say, what is the meaning of life? Okay. Now, his answer is going to be surprising. Really, he doesn't have a meaning. Is what it comes down to, other than to serve God. But we get to that later. So I want to get into this because there's a couple of things other than that I want to point out. And let's bring up our. Now, before I do that, let me just say this. I'm using the Holman Christian Standard Bible, and I am I because of that, because I'm using the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Sometimes the translation, oh, excuse me, the translation comes out different. And so if you are, especially if you read the King James. Now, of course, I became a Christian under the King James. So I read the King James, thoroughly indoctrinated with the King James. Even now, if you can sometimes listen, I will have to correct myself from not making a King James, translation when I speak. I like the Holman Christian Standard. That is my translation that I like. The English Standard Version is another version. So as you look at this particular Bible app that I'm using, I've got two different. I got the Holman Christian Standard. The Holman Christian Standard and then the English Standard Version. The reason why I have these two is because the English Standard Version is very close to the New King James. So the reason why I wanted to start off with that, because it's going to be a little different if you're used to that translation. The first thing he says is, verse chapter. This is chapter 1, verse 1 says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem." And then verse 2, "Vanities of vanities," says the preachers. I kind of want to focus on that, only to say, since I'm reading from the Holman Christian Standard, and if you notice, he says here, "The words of the teacher, the son of David, king of Israel, king in Israel," and then absolute futility, says the teacher. Now, I'm only going to linger on this just for a moment. Here's the thing with translations. Basically, they say the same thing. There are people that have an issue with any translation other than the King James. There's some that even have trouble with the New King James. When we talk about the original language, which most of us don't speak, so in this case it's Hebrew. In the New Testament it's Greek. So we depend upon the translators. So we depend upon the um, scholars who translate. What I want to say is that they say the same thing. So futility, vanity, the meaning of it is the same. And when it says the preacher in the King James, or even if we read in the English Standard Version, what is it? So if you think about the term of the preacher, you can't, what he's not, this is one of the reasons why I do like the Holman Christian Standard, is that they really, really, really strive to give the most accurate translation of the original language. Okay, if whether they get it right or not, I'm not a scholar, so I can't say. But excuse me. But the idea is that if you like here, if I look up the Hebrew word for teacher as he used it, the Hebrew word that the other translations translate preacher, well, they all pretty much mean the same thing. The Hebrew word, and I'm gonna tell you how I use this. I know I'm going a little bit off, but this here is one of the oldest books I have. It is a strong concordance, and this. And I'm going to say that this concordance here. The reason why I like it is because they literally have every letter. So even the A. In other words, a concordance, as you may know, has every word where it is used in the Bible. So, like I said, that's an old one, and then they also have then short meanings. So the idea that one of the ways that I have this book here is a Zoroastrian Greek study. Of course, there's vines. I believe this right here. This vines has some Old Testament words, but not a lot. So the biggest part, unless I'm a Hebrew scholar, Strong's is where I'm going to get a short definition of the Hebrew words. And the short definition of whether you put preacher or teacher, the Hebrew word meaning is this: lecturer. Okay, so that's why I say they say the same thing. They say the same thing. So he says the words of the teacher, and then he says son of David, king in Israel. So in this particular verse here, it identifies Solomon as the writer of this book right here. And as I said, each chapter is going to deal with some insights into life. And so we'll deal with them as we go along. Okay, we deal with them as we go along. Now, in chapter 2, when we get to chapter 2, it's going to be very interesting because in chapter 2, he deals with um, an issue in chapter 2 about being foolish in his wisdom. Being foolish in his wisdom. All right, so let's get into it. Chapter 1, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1 again. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. And then it says, absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute fertility. Or, at the king. So what is futility? Or meaningless. In other words, you come to the end and it's futile. It has no meaning. No, not so much as purpose, but the purpose itself doesn't solve anything. And that's kind of what he's talking about. This is going to be sort of his go-to phrase that you may say, you may ask the question, what do we do in life? And he's going to tackle some things that are going to be very interesting. So, for example, the rich man and the poor man, right, both die. And at death, what does their existence mean? And then he says, it's fruitful or a vanity. I mean, it doesn't accomplish anything. One other statement he's going to make is that a person you take now, and this is to take all the rich people, and then also yourself. You could work for something only to leave it to a fool. I'll give you one more thing, because I know, again, I'm way kind of off right here, but this sort of kind of sets the tone of the book here. I'm at retirement age, and I remember seeing different guys who were at retirement age who had worked on the job for 30, 35, 40 years. And then at the end of that, what did all of that work mean? In a sense, nothing. The job went on. In this particular case, the job went on. Their last day, in the sense of working, that really meant nothing. And that was the most interesting thing there. So absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute futility. Everything is futile, meaning doesn't mean anything when you really get down to it. Verse 3. What does a man gain for all his efforts that he labors under the sun? That's what he means by that. What is the end of it? It's futile. Now, also keep this in mind that this is from the standpoint of the physical life. He's not dealing with eternity, spiritual things. Because in a sense, we could answer the question, what is done for Christ, you take into eternity. I'm going to deal with that in the next chapter. But notice he says, what does a man gain for all his efforts that he labors under the sun? In fact, you know what? I might deal with this right now because I think this is so important here. Yes, I'm going to deal with this right now. So notice the question again. What does a man gain for all his effort that he labors under the sun? Now, I want to keep this in mind that under the sun here is the earthly life that we live. Okay, it is not the eternity. I'm going to answer the question now from a spiritual perspective. Okay, this thing here always give me trouble. First Corinthians. If I don't spell it right, it won't do it. All right, I'm going to read. I'm going to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And I'm going to read this because I want to answer the question, and this would be a good setup for us to read. I may come back to this again, especially in chapter 2, but this is Paul addressing the issue of speaking in tongues in the church. But I want you to notice how he addresses it right here. So this chapter is sandwiched between chapter 12 and chapter 14. 12 talks about the gifts of the Spirit, the operation of the gifts of the Spirit, and then 14 specifically deal with the purpose of speaking in tongues in the public assembly. But this is how before he gets to teaching on that, this is what he talks about right here. First, 1 Corinthians 13, and then he says, if I speak in tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, so keep that in mind, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have the prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith that I can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and I deliver up my body to be burned, but do not have love, I gain nothing. So remember the question that Ecclesiastes is dealing with. So the idea here is that love is the issue here. Now I want you to understand that if I don't have love, in other words, he's not questioning whether or not doing these things are good or bad. What he is questioning here is, if I do not do them in love, they're nothing. Verse 4. Love is patient, is kind. Love does not envy, boast. It's not arrogant, rude. Does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoice with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endure all things. Now watch this. Love never ends. Now I want to stop and look at that statement. Love never ends, because oftentimes when you hear this, people kind of mistranslate this, misapply it. I mean that if you show an act of love to someone else, you may win that person. That's not what he's saying here. Because if that's the case, then Jesus failed. Jesus' act of love on several occasions The same crowd said, crucify him. But also keep this in mind that this chapter that what Paul is dealing with how does whatever I do benefits me. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about how it benefits you. He talks about how it benefits me. That's why he says, if I do these things, but I don't have love, okay, then love, it means nothing. So then he says, love never ends. For who? For me. He says, as for prophecy, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect is come, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. But some of us do, right? For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully as I am known. Shall be known. Verse 13. So now faith, hope, and love abides, these three. But then he says the greatest of these is love. Now what is he saying here? The greatest of these is love. Because what you do in love is what you're going to take into eternity. And that's the point I want to make. That what you do for love, see, you take into eternity. So in other words, this chapter here is not dealing with the benefits you may or may not have on someone else. That this is kind of the way there was a movie a number of years ago called The Cross and the Switchblade. And the evangelist's name was David Wilkerson. And it showed that David, and it was based upon his encounter that you had this kind of like country preacher who goes to the rough streets, inner city of New York City. Now, this was in the 60s, by the way. And then he would preach to the gangs. And this one particular notorious gang member, I think his name is Nicky Cruz, that he was notorious, cutthroat. And actually, there is a movie out on it. So if you want to kind of Google the movie, you can watch the movie. You know, um, it's called The Cross and the Switchblade. And so one of the things that he was confronted by the gangs. He was threatened by the gangs. And at one point, the guy, I think, put a switchblade on him and said, man, if you don't stop preaching this Jesus, I'm kind of paraphrasing the whole scene here, I'm going to cut you in 1,000 pieces. And then Nicky Cruz responded, and every 1,000 piece will cry out, I love you. That's a paraphrase, okay? And then in the end, he ended up winning Nicky Cruz to the Lord. Okay? Now, so my point is, a lot of people take that as that's kind of a model. If you just persevere in love, then ultimately you can win or will win people over. All you have to do is just persevere in love. That's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about how love in this chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, how love benefits you. You can even say that this is probably one of the most selfish chapters in this respect. He's talking about how my act of love benefits me. That when it's all said and done, I can't take my wealth, my fame, but what I did in love, those are the things that's going to go into eternity. So I wanted to kind of plant that thought. And as we look at now, when he asks the question back in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, and then in verse 3, what does a man gain for all his efforts that he labors under the sun? So I kind of threw that in as a bonus. Okay, he's asking the question. Well, what does the man gain? What does he gain for all his effort? Well, if he does it in love, I'm taking some liberties. All right, what I'm going to do, pick it up in the next chapter here. So don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. And I will see you in the next study.